Chapter 13, Part 2. So in Part 1, we saw the work of Leonardo da Vinci and Raphael. Just two artists dominated that. And in this part, we're going to look at the work of Michelangelo and others. So, Michelangelo Buonarroti, he was an apprentice to Domenico Ghirlandaio. He joined the household of Lorenzo de' Medici at the age of 13. So it's hard to imagine this man being a 13-year-old, but everybody was at some point. So this is the house again that we saw in early Renaissance art, the Medici, the Palazzo Medici. While he was with the Medici, he came in contact with Neoplatonic philosophers and discussed the art of sculpture as a metaphor for the discovery of the moral truth of the soul. He was very intellectual, but a lot of people believe he lacked some social graces, which is why Raphael depicted him as that glum man sitting by himself in the School of Athens. An early work of his is the marble Pietà. The subject of the Virgin supporting and mourning the dead Jesus was rare in Italian art of the time. The size disparity between the large Virgin and Jesus is forgotten when viewing the smooth modeling and deftly carved forms. So this was placed in Old St. Peter's, which was the church built by Constantine. It was commissioned by a German who was living in Italy at the time, and this subject was very popular in Germany. There are many examples in the Gothic period, but we had to cut out a lot. So this was an early commission. The pyramidal composition works visually because Michelangelo has given the Virgin's clothing so much bulk that even though she's a small woman and she's supporting this larger body of Jesus, it works visually because of his use of all of this fabric here. So this also reflects that ideal composition. It's very calm. There's no drama here. It's wider at the bottom, so it's extremely stable and perfect. People loved it. And there's an urban legend that when this was first put in the niche in St. Peter's, that everybody came and was oohing and awing over this. And Michelangelo wanted to know what people were saying, so he sort of joined the crowd and listened to what they were saying. And people had no idea who had made it. They'd say, who did this? Was it so-and-so? Was it Donatello? Was it Ghiberti? And nobody knew. So the legend, and I'm saying it's just an urban legend, is that he came back with his chisel in the night and carved his name on this strap that goes across the Virgin's chest. So I don't know if that's true. But it's carved out of a single piece of marble. What he does is remove, he said that he would see a figure in a block of marble and just remove everything that didn't belong. And so that was kind of his method. And this is what he claimed for doing David, his most famous statue. The statue of David was commissioned for a buttress of the church in Florence, but everybody loved it so much that it was placed out in the city square instead. And to this day, there's a copy of it out in the city square, but now the original is in a museum in Florence. So this is another David, and we have seen David's, but this is Michelangelo's interpretation of that same story. So I told you this story, and I want to emphasize that Michelangelo here for this figure was also drawing on classical ideals, but only for the figure, for this heroic nude male. He changes up the face considerably. So this is the Hermes that I showed you in the period of classical Greece, and compare that to Michelangelo's David, and you can see there's no peace, there's no calm, there's no perfection. There's a great deal of stress and focus on David. So let's look at some more. Oh, I should also say, there's so many points to make about this, that it was designed to be up on a plinth like this. And so Michelangelo enlarged the head and gave David this intense, shaggy head of curls and deep set eyes, so that when a person is standing down here and gazing up, this is about where your head would be, and you're looking up at David, you would be able to see this intense expression even from down below. So here's another thought. I've shown you David's from the early Renaissance. And here's an extra one. This is the Donatello that you saw. And this is a very similar David by Verrocchio, who was Leonardo's master, meaning his teacher. And this is Michelangelo. So these are two early Renaissance, and this is high Renaissance. First of all three of these figures were made in Florence. And Florence likes its David, identifies with David for a very important reason. Rome was a giant city. Rome was the head of the Roman Empire, the head of the church. Rome was like Goliath. And Florence was a little upstart, this little town up in the hills of northern Italy. And there's an identity here that it wants to be as great as Rome. It kind of wants to take the place of Rome in terms of prominence of thought and creativity. So we know the Pope's not going to move there, but they can have everything else. And that's kind of the aspiration of Florence. Now, in terms of the narrative of David, both of these show David after killing the giant. So his body is at rest. Notice how similar the poses are. Contrapposto, all the weight on the right foot, the left foot's free. The severed head in both of these lies at the foot, and both Davids carry a sword. Both are shown very young. That's just sort of the usual interpretation of David as he was a teenager. And then Michelangelo shows a different moment. So instead of showing us the perfection and the relaxed mood of a victorious David, he shows us David who has not yet killed Goliath. David is alert, he's aware, he's not sure he's going to be able to do this. He's sizing up Goliath. He's staring at him with this great concentration. He has over his arm his slingshot. In this hand, he carries his stones that he's going to put in the slingshot. He has more than one, just in case he needs to hurl more. He's also shown as a slightly older, more mature, physically mature male, not quite so adolescent. So I think this is important, this moment, and it sort of shows us something about the High Renaissance, that there's more ambition, there's more force or fierceness about it. So Michelangelo saw himself as a sculptor, always a sculptor, primarily a sculptor. He loved his marble. And so the Pope, Julius II, invited Michelangelo to come down to Rome and make his tomb, because the popes, when they died, would typically get to be buried in St. Peter's or someplace very close, and be in their tomb would be something very special, so they would never be forgotten. But when Michelangelo arrived in Rome, the Pope pulled a bait and switch. He said, I'd love for you to design my tomb. You just go ahead and think about that. But in the meantime, I would like you to paint the ceiling of this little chapel that has been there. And it's a great project because, look, All these other painters painted these nice frescoes on the side walls, but nobody did anything to the ceiling. So let's take care of that, huh? And Michelangelo wasn't really happy. He said, I'm a sculptor, I'm not a painter. But the Pope insisted, and he wouldn't let him work on the tomb until the ceiling was done. There's even a movie about this starring Charlton Heston as Michelangelo, um, called The Agony and the Ecstasy. So you can, it's a very old movie though. I would warn you about it. So the Sistine Chapel ceiling was ordered by Pope Julius II, who wanted the theme to be the 12 apostles. But Michelangelo found that too limiting. So he chose a different theme. Shallow bands of painted stone molding divided the vault into 9 compartments showing scenes from Genesis. So Michelangelo chose to show the creation and fall of the world here. And you can see this huge, big, gently barrel vaulted ceiling. He divided up into separate frames with different painting in each one. So they don't, I mean, they relate to each other thematically, but not compositionally. So there's the entire ceiling on the left. And here's a breakdown of what the themes are on the right. So the overall theme is the creation of the world and the fall of man, how God created a perfect and beautiful world, and then people screwed it up. So going from here, God is almost always personified as a white male, an older white male. So God the Father here separating light from dark, and you can read all of the themes over here. The center one that you can probably see right there is the creation of Adam. This one gets a little confusing. There's quite a bit going on there, but it's the creation of Eve. And then we have the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden, and on and on and on until you get to the very last scene, which is the drunkenness of Noah. So this one, just below the drunkenness of Noah, shows this little houseboat out in the water. That was how Michelangelo envisioned the ark, Noah's ark. And for some reason, the drunkenness of Noah is the low point. And instead of the murder of Cain and Abel, or the murder scene. Usually that is considered the low part. So let's look at this one little frame. This is the iconic creation of Adam, shows God as a white male, sparking life into Adam. So he's created Adam, who's lounging on a rock over here. And God, in this cape with his entourage, reaches out his hand and touches the forefinger of Adam, giving him life. I believe originally the figure of God was nude, but there was a correction done, and God was clothed. There was a lot of this going on, of people objecting to nudity, especially when you're talking about divine beings like God and Jesus. So this is Michelangelo. Then many years later, he came back and painted the end wall of the Sistine Chapel. So it is widely believed that Michelangelo was influenced by the ideas of the religious reformers of the Protestant Reformation. The Last Judgment wall was painted between 1535 and 1541 behind the altar in the Sistine Chapel. The saved swarm around a central Christ, while the damned are guided by the demonic boatman Charon toward hell. So it's also believed that many of these evil have portraits, are actual portraits of people that Michelangelo didn't like. I don't know. Jesus up here was also shown in the nude originally and had to be corrected, so he had to have that loincloth placed over him. I think the Virgin Mary may also have been. So this is a very young, very bulky, beefy Jesus in the center with short, almost blonde hair and no beard. His right hand gesturing upward, the gesture of salvation, of signaling this upward movement of the good souls into heaven. And so all of this is the crowd of heaven up here. And then his left hand gesturing downwards, telling bad people, and here we go, tumbling down into hell. There's the boatman ferrying people across the river Styx. There's a hell mouth over here. So in terms of subject matter, this is similar to the judgment scenes of Romanesque churches, which we saw copied by Giotto in the Arena Chapel when he had a similar scene on the back wall, or the back wall of the Arena Chapel. So it's still being used. Anyway, Last Judgment. So Michelangelo, definitely a Renaissance man. He painted, he sculpted. What else can he do? So Donato Bramante undertook the task of rebuilding St. Peter's Basilica. It was built with a central plan, possibly referring to the tradition of Christian martyria. Ultimately, Michelangelo transformed St. Peter's into a building of magnificent proportion. Hemicycles and blind windows remain today from his design. So he designed the dome. He designed a lot of this. This is not the public view. This is the back side of New St. Peter's. And we will give a much longer look to St. Peter's when we get to the Baroque period. But basically, this is what was going on to remodel the church and as a great, great sort of capital monument of the whole Christian world. That was the idea. This is old St. Peter's that was completely demolished. It was built by Constantine in the 4th century. Then the plans started with Bramante's central plan like this, showing this equal-armed cross and all these little chapels off of it. I'm sure that the tomb of Peter was to be right there in the center. Then it was enlarged. This was Michelangelo's plan, putting a single bay out in front, so sort of extending it, but not really, giving a narthex, a porch out there. And then finally, this plan, so it retains a lot of this, the tomb of Peter right there in the center, and then the bays of a nave down here. And like I say, I'll show you. Only the last one and the first one were actually built. So that's it for Michelangelo. Going to see a little bit more of what else was going on in Italy. This segment is slightly longer than the first one, so just bear with me. I just wanted to put a break in where it was convenient, and that was after Raphael. So Properzio was the only woman included in Giorgio Vasari's 1550 edition of Lives of the Artist. It is written that a rival male sculptor prevented her from being paid fairly or receiving further commissions. And this was a relief carved by this female artist. So the publisher of the book includes a lot of women artists just for representation, just to show it wasn't all men. But it's hard to accept these women as the equal of men yet. I mean, she's doing great stuff, but she was up against a lot of odds. So we will stop and look at the work of women artists later in greater depth. So now we're going to look at what was happening in Venice. Venice was so far away, and it was not really directly affected by what was going on in Florence or Rome. So this artist, Giorgione, is very significant in the history of art because he showed such prodigious skill, but he did die young. He died from the plague. But his contribution to Venetian painting was vast. Only 10 paintings can be attributed to him. Poesie, or an enigmatic pastoral themes, were inspired by the literary revival of pastoral poetry. The Tempest here was painted shortly before his death. A woman in the foreground is nude except for a white cloth over her shoulders. On the other side, a mysterious man in a soldier's uniform turns his head toward the woman. This is perhaps his most famous painting, The Tempest. And I'm not going to say much more. But the pastoral concert has been attributed to both Titian and Giorgione. Possibly both of them worked on this together. It portrays an idyllic, verdant landscape with two clothed men who seem oblivious to two nude women beside them. The quality thought to be Titian's is the sensuously painted flesh of the females. And we will see this again later. We will focus on some Titian art, so just hold on. Women patrons of the arts. So Mary I and Elizabeth I are both glorified their reigns in England with art. Habsburg princesses Margaret of Austria and Mary of Hungary presided over humanist courts during their reigns. Isabella d'Este of Mantua became a true Renaissance woman, patronizing painters, musicians, writers, and collecting ancient art and objects. And she had her portrait painted by Titian, who's the Venetian artist we just saw a hint of. Titian is regarded by many as perhaps being the greatest Italian Renaissance painter, greater than the ones that I've already shown you. So I'm just saying, you can make up your own mind. He's known for loosening up brushstroke and not requiring such really strict control of his painting. That was a difficult example. It's difficult to show you, but in addition to that, he also revolutionized a lot of compositions. So this is one of Titian's masterpieces. The Pesaro Madonna was commissioned for an altar. It shows grandeur in its massive columns and marble staircase. The colors were built up in layers of red, white, black, and yellow. It is oil on canvas, so you can build up your layers when you're using oil paints. I hope you remember that. Intersecting diagonals in the composition reach from Jacopo Pesaro to the off-center Virgin. So there's a strong diagonal here. There's a diagonal here with this flag. This is it's kind of a dynamic composition because that stability of this balance that we saw in other paintings around Florence has been disrupted here by Titian. He's daring to sort of break out of that mold and try some different things. And then I think he found that the bottom was too weighty in terms of composition, and so he added this little cloud with some putti on it up above to sort of balance it. So here's an example of another Venetian painting of the same essential subject matter, which included the Virgin and Child visiting with some saints. It's called the Holy Conversation. And this is what you have here, only you've got the family that commissioned it included. So you can see how revolutionary Titian was, how he broke out of this stability, this balance and calm with this diagonal line. But here's perhaps the one he's most famous for, and this is the Venus of Urbino. It's contrary to its stark female nudity. It may have been a reference to marriage. The Cassoni in the background and sleeping dog, the symbol for fidelity, revealed that the work may have been associated with Guidobaldo della Rovere's marriage. I'm not saying that. I've always thought of her as a mistress, but anyway, we're just going to look at it and not consider the context because we don't really know. But this nude female is neither a goddess nor a courtesan, meaning she's not a prostitute. The woman was possibly a wife. Many others think she's a courtesan. But here she is posing in the foreground right up against the front of the screen, completely nude, completely shameless. Like our earlier Venuses that we saw in the classical world, she is nude for a reason. She is just finished bathing, and her maids are back here getting her some clothes out of her chest. Her dog is sleeping. This white cloth is possibly the sheet she dried herself with after the bath. We will visit her again because this painting has a lot of influence in later art. There you go. So more in Venice and the Veneto. The subject of the feast in the house of Levi appears to be architecture of the house rather than its inhabitants. Um, the large scale allowed for a realistically proportional figure. So this is a huge painting. It was painted for a refectory at a monastery too. It is 42 feet long. It is 18 feet tall. So the height of 3 humans. This is about where a 6-foot tall man's head would come in this. This is so big. Oil on canvas. I cannot even imagine where they got a piece of canvas that big. They had to have sewn together several. Anyway, it's a very interesting painting. I've included some bonus features on Canvas about this painting. So if you're interested, please take a look at it. Go. Oh, here. You can look at it even better. I'm not going to talk about it too much because I've already talked about it in the bonus features. And if you're interested, please look at it. But Jesus is in the center, glowing. He's got a slight glow about his head. And his disciples are there somewhere, but there's lots of other people. It's like a cast of thousands. Here's another Last Supper. And this one I really like because I think it suggests a movement that's coming called Mannerism. And it's so different from like Leonardo's Last Supper. This Last Supper creates a mood of intense spirituality. A brilliant light emanates from Jesus and the disciples. Figures twist and gesture, drawing the viewer inward toward the sacred drama. So, like Titian, Tintoretto used a diagonal to drive up the energy in this scene. It's not stable, it's not quiet at all. And the spiritual dimension is hinted at with these puffs of smoke that seem to take form, looking like spirits floating around the ceiling, suggesting that there's an event happening here of great importance. Now, just look at all the figures, and I told you that the artist is always going to use a device to show us where the villain is, where is Judas, the betrayer. So there should be 11 disciples. There should be Jesus. All of them are going to look quite different from Judas. I like to play this game in class too, and I even give my students laser pointers so they can figure it out, point to it. But now that you've had a chance to study it, you can see all of these men on this side of the table have this little glow about their head. Jesus has a very intense glow because, he's God, so he's offering something to this disciple next to him. The one person seated at the table who is not glowing is this man right here, and that's Judas. He's even cut off, literally cut off from the other disciples by the table. So he's isolated by his lack of a halo, by his position on the other side of the table. It's just really sad for him. I like this painting a lot, so I hope you do too. And there you can compare the two. So Leonardo with his calm perfection, his balance, and Tintoretto who's really shaking things up. About 100 years after Leonardo, side by side, you can see the two. It's profound, I think. So what's happening in architecture? Well, we're going to look briefly at architecture just in terms of this one structure, and then we'll look more at Mannerism, and that'll be it for Italy. So in I Quattro Libri dell'Architettura was published on the subject of ideal architectural proportions in 1570. Sorry, I have bad English in that sentence. This was designed by Andrea Palladio, and you can tell by looking at it that his inspiration comes from the classical world. So this is our first example where a contemporary architect is bringing a temple facade that we saw in Greece and Rome and Etruscan art. He's bringing it into the new, the here and now, a new design. So the Villa Rotunda outside Vicenza was designed as a party house. It secularized the dome. This is not a church. This is a home. But it was more of a pleasure, like a retreat or a place not for everyday living, but a place for special events. The plan consisted of a circle inscribed within symmetrical squares. So like Brunelleschi, Palladio is obsessed with these proportions and with perfection. And he was so obsessed that he didn't know exactly what else to do with his temple facade, so he made a square and put that on each facade. So you can see two of them here. His source was Vitruvius and Vitruvius's books on architecture, who described the Etruscan temples with sculptures on the roof, so he puts sculptures on the roof. You've got to love this. And there's the Vitruvian model and the temple that was built in Rome. And here's the plan for the Villa Rotunda, showing the symmetry of it, this rigid perfection. The proportions of every rectangular room were all exactly the same. And these passageways lead out to the porches. So 4 porches exactly the same with the columns. The only thing different was what you saw when you walked out the door. So the landscape was different at each door. That's Palladio, and he's going to be a huge influence later on, we will see. Mannerism. This was a movement characterized by artificiality, grace, and elegance over ordered balance. The style of Mannerism is all about style. It overlaps later High Renaissance, so it's happening simultaneously to some of the things we've seen. So don't think of it as after, but it's simultaneous. Artists distorted conventions and created contrived, enigmatic forms. The example on the right is a Mannerist painting where it's a reflection from a convex mirror with this very large hand at the bottom. And it was all kind of to get the oohs and ahs from the viewers. Everything was different. Carucci's Depositions shows an ambitious composition with a dreamy atmosphere and odd poses. Jarring colors are juxtaposed. So if you start to really stare at this, the details, it looks a little upsetting. Like this figure here, his body seems deformed. His back is extremely pink. There's a big void in the center, just sort of filled with some arms. It's different. This is perhaps the most different of all of the different Mannerist paintings. So Bronzino's allegory with Venus and Cupid is one of the strangest paintings of the 16th century. Complex interweaving of 7 figures, 3 masks, and a dove press into the foreground. Venus and her son Cupid engage in unsettlingly erotic actions, while Kronos pulls back a curtain to expose them. So this is Venus in the foreground, her son grabbing her breast. She's got an apple in her left hand, and this man, Kronos, is exposing them. If you start picking away at details, it gets more and more upsetting. This man seems like in agony over here. A woman who seems to be missing her eyes, just sort of black holes there, a mask down here. And what about this figure? Whose hand is that? You see, it's just all very odd. This is Mannerism, and it will show up on the quiz. You will need to know this is Mannerist art. Another Mannerist artist who doesn't seem so Mannerist is Sophonisba Anguissola. She was a skilled miniaturist, and she worked as a court painter to the Queen of Spain from 1560, but her works were lost in a palace fire, so we really don't have very much that she painted, but we know she had a very good career. And this one, also another woman, Lavinia Fontana, found a successful career in Bologna that would later boast her to position of papal court painter in 1603. Noli Me Tangere shows Christ revealing himself to Mary Magdalene following his resurrection. Its unsettling diagonal plunge into depth is characteristic of the Mannerist style. So this diagonal from foreground here back into the scene at the tomb back there. And that is it for part 2. Stay tuned for part 3. We will go to the north of Europe for part 3 and 4.